Hey guys, Sam Miller from Panel Precision. Welcome back to the Precision Rifle Load Development Series. Alright, in episode 7 we're going to be working with brass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 100 pieces of once fired brass from my comp rifle out to the shop and demonstrate my complete process from start to finish on getting it ready to shoot again. Okay, this video will be pretty detailed, but if you need more information on the sizing process or the dies or things like that, be sure to check out panelprecision.com and this YouTube channel. There's a ton of content on there about working with brass, the differences between all the dies, how to select neck bushings, things like that. As always, I appreciate your comments and feedback. Be sure to leave any comments or questions about this video right in the comments section below the video description. Be sure to like the video, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Alright, let's head on out to the shop. Okay, so I have 100 pieces of once fired brass here. I have 2 trays. So what I'm going to do is while I'm prepping this, I'm going to be moving the brass from one tray to the next, and I'll just do it in steps. Now the first thing I do with fired brass is knock the primers out of it. I get a lot of questions about why I do that. The biggest reason is convenience. I can have 100 pieces of 260 Remington, 50 pieces of 300 Win Mag, 20 pieces of 7 WSM, some 260 Terminator brass, all in once fired state or in fired state, and I can just bring it all right to my press with a universal decapping die, knock all the primers out of it, and get that step done. I don't have to change dies, I don't have to change anything. All I have to do is pop the shell holder out according to what size case I'm working with. The second reason is, one time when I was reloading, I don't remember what cartridge it was, I was having some weird readings on it. Right before I started sizing. So I'd measure it, I'd get my shoulder bump measurement, I'd run it through the die, and of course when I was depriming in the main die, it would pop the old primer out, and when it would come out, I would have a weird measurement. I was like, what's going on here? Well, I figured out that sometimes when you fire a cartridge in certain rifles, the firing pin will leave a chunk sticking up off the top of the primer. So you'll have an indent, but you also have a piece that comes up. So it's like the primer tried to flow around the firing pin. Well, when that happens, you get just a sliver of material above the case head. So it's not really the dimension of the case head, it's the dimension of the primer. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to stop doing all that stuff. I'll deprime everything in one shot. And when I was shooting 223 in really big batches, it really helped keep my dies clean. Because you just can't keep that crap out of your dies. I don't care how careful you are, how well you run it through a tumbler or whatever, you're going to end up with the junk in the primer pocket from a fired primer in your dies if you don't clean it out first. So that's 2 reasons. One is the convenience of it. 2 is because my measurements are spot on. And number 3 is it keeps everything clean. Alright, this is the RCBS Universal Decapping Die. All it does is deprime cases. It's universal because it'll work from 22 caliber up to 45. The only limits are the diameter of the piece that holds the decapping pin in there. It will deprime cases down to 22 caliber, and then the diameter of the case body itself, I guess they're figuring on something up to 45 caliber. I've used this for 223 cases all the way up to 300 Remington Ultra Mag cases on one setting. So I just leave it long and deprime all of those cases and everything in between without touching it. This press is Marksman. This is new to me. It's been out for about a year now, I guess. I'm going to be doing a full review on this press, and so far I'm very, very impressed with it. One of the really cool features about it is it has a totally enclosed primer recovery system. So when I'm depriming this brass, it goes down the tube and comes out on the bottom in a tray. So instead of having like a half circle tray here like most do, it actually goes down through the bottom and comes out. There's no way for it to pop out and fall on the floor and all that other junk. Another thing I really like about it is this shell holder clip. Just snap it in place. Makes it real easy to replace your shell holders when you need to. But anyway, all I'm going to do is I'm going to stick the case in. You hear it hit the tray out there. Drop it in that one. Okay, so that's 100 260 Remington cases I just deprimed. You can see all the primers fell into the tray here. And then this is a tray that goes on the bottom, so this would actually be on your bench. This sits right under the press, and the only thing that tray, the primary tray, didn't catch was one anvil and a couple little flakes of carbon or whatever from inside the primer cup. The vast majority of it fell right into this tray, and that's pretty slick. I love this press for that. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean out the primer pockets. I use a uniforming tool. This is a Possum Hollow, I believe. I don't even know if they make it anymore. I couldn't find it on their website, but it has a carbide cutter for large rifle primers on this side, or pockets, and then it has a cutter for small rifle primer pockets on the other side. And it's fully adjustable. And I used to use this when I had to make all the primer pockets uniform on some Remington brass and some Winchester brass. But anyway, it's barely going to just touch the bottom of this Lapua brass, but it'll clean out all the carbon and the junk in the bottom of the pocket. Now, I don't know how important that is for performance, but it's just a habit that I just can't seem to break, so I do that. Now, a lot of this stuff you can do. You don't have to be in the shop, you don't have to be in your reloading room. You can be sitting down watching something you recorded on DVR, or listening to your kids talk or whatever while you're doing this. This is pretty mindless work, and you can do it anywhere. What I do is I just do it right over the cases I'm working on, so all the junk gets left in the bins and not on the floor, and it just transfer over to the next tray. Normally just takes 1 or 2 swipes, and it gets all the junk out of the bottom of it. Alright, so you can see all the junk that was inside those primer pockets, mostly down at the bottom of them, and that's just from 100 260 Remington cases. So now we don't have all that crap messing up our dies, we don't have it contaminating our media. I think it's just a good idea. Now, yes, there are some motorized prep stations, and I'm looking at getting one because I've been doing this just like this for over 20 years, and man, it does get tedious when you have really big batches to do. And I'm going to have really big batches with this rifle. So look for some kind of a motorized unit sitting on this bench sometime in the next month or two. Okay, the next thing I like to do is just give the necks, the outsides of the necks, a real quick swipe just to get the big carbon off of them. And I use superfine steel wool for that. Doesn't take much, just a real quick swipe. That just makes sure that we don't have a bunch of junk going into our bushing on our bushing die, and it also makes sure that we get an accurate measurement on our outside neck. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to do before I do all the measurements and all that stuff on these cases is clean the inside of the neck out. So I just use a bronze bore brush and just run it in there and give it one swipe. Just want all the junk out of it, and that's it. Okay, now that our brass is clean, the next thing I'm going to do is take some measurements. So I'm using a 20A comparator insert. This is the bump gauge insert from Sinclair. And I'm going to use this to measure our shoulder length, so from the case head to the shoulder. So I'm going to put the comparator in, and then I'm going to zero out the caliper. .566. So let's record that right here. Alright, and the next one is just kind of a curiosity measurement. So I'm going to take the comparator out and zero the caliper again and just check overall length. 2.0285. Okay, the next one's going to be our shoulder diameter. So right here where the shoulder turns into the case body, right at the bottom of the body taper basically. .456. Then we want to measure our web diameter, which is right under the extractor groove. And that'll be the fattest part of this tapered case. This is just a bottleneck case, so it gets fatter as it goes up towards the extractor. Obviously, if it was the other way around, you'd never be able to get the case in and out of the chamber. So let's see what we have here. 4705. And then our last measurement is going to be the neck OD. So this is coming right out of the chamber, fired. And what we're looking for is the fattest measurement we can get. So when you measure these, what you're going to see is you can see all the imperfections from the thickness variation coming out in this outside diameter. So I'm going to say 298. Alright, so now our brass is measured. Now we can set up our die, but before we do, let's go over some of these measurements here. I'll show them to you. Okay, so you remember we measured all this stuff before we started shooting this brass. I took all these measurements off new brass before I did anything at all. So the first one you see there is the shoulder length. That's from the case head to the shoulder. You know, when you draw up reamers or you're talking about SAMI specs, it's to a datum line, which is somewhere in the middle of that shoulder angle. I'm not entirely sure where the comparator hits it. So, you know, these measurements are literally comparative measurements. So if you email me and ask me, hey, I've got this 260, these are my shoulder lengths, this is all that, it's probably not going to match mine. You know, you're kind of relying on the variations and the tolerances and how they make those comparator gauge inserts. So this is literally a comparative number for you to use. So when we look at our new piece of brass, it was 1.557. When we fired it in this chamber, it grew to 1.566. You look at the overall length, that's from the case head to the end of the neck, it only grew by 1.5 thousandths. Our shoulder diameter grew by 5 thousandths. Our web diameter grew by, what, 2 thousandths. Our neck OD, now remember I set that with a Okay, before we get rolling on setting up the sizing die, I'm just going to throw a plug in there for full length sizing. I know a lot of guys think that you have to neck size only to get the most accuracy out of your rifle. Well, I don't believe that at all. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it. I'm just going to say if you want to know more about what I think in that, go read my article, Full Length Sizing for Reliable Precision. And I lay it all out right there. It's on the website. What we're going to do with this brass is we're going to bump the shoulder back 2 thousandths and we're going to let the body sizing part of the die do all of its work. And when we get done, I'll write down the measurements that I get from the brass coming right out of the die, and you can see that it didn't change much. And furthermore, you've seen how this gun shoots with brand new brass, which is as loose as it's ever going to be in the chamber. So when we come out of the sizing die, it's going to be really close to the fired dimension of the brass, only it's going to size it down just enough to give us the kind of reliability that we need in a field gun. Okay, before I start setting up this die, let's talk about the different kinds of dies. Both of these are full-length sizing dies. They're both made by Redding, both for 260 Remington. The one on the left is the Type S full-length bushing sizing die. The one on the right is just a standard sizing die. The difference between the two dies is that this one takes interchangeable bushings, so you can change the diameter that the neck gets sized. The one on the right, you cannot do that without honing it out or doing some kind of machine work on it. The one on the right relies on the expander mandrel to set the dimension of your neck. You have to have the expander in there, otherwise it's going to come out way too tight. The reason for that is they make the full-length sizing die, the standard one, so that it will size all different kinds of brass. So in other words, if you use different thicknesses of brass within the same chambering, that die is sized small enough that it will size down the thinnest piece of brass you'll ever use. And then the thick pieces of brass will get sized down to a smaller inside diameter, but it doesn't matter because you're going to use the mandrel to set every piece of brass that goes through that die to the same dimension. Well, on the bushing die, you can change the bushings out to use in different thicknesses of brass, and you can also set it so that it only sizes the neck down as much as you need. Now, I'll tell you that I do not leave the mandrels in my bushing dies. I take them out. So when you see the pieces laid out there like that, the priming cap or the priming pin, depriming pin, is on the end of that rod. So when I take that out, I no longer have any kind of depriming capability. So that doesn't matter to me because I deprime with a universal die anyway. But if you're going to copy me by taking that out, because that also has the expander mandrel on it, you need to retain that black piece in the middle between the bushing and the top screw. Otherwise the bushing will not sit down inside this die tight enough to get any sizing on the neck. So that actually holds it in place. So now another question I get a lot of is, why do my necks not come out sized all the way? Well, they physically can't do that because the die has a shelf in here that holds that bushing. So the bushing has to sit on top of something, and then these two pieces hold it down against that shelf. So the thickness of that shelf is what you don't get in neck sizing. It's it's necessary to have that, obviously, to have a removable bushing. So that's why you don't get sizing all the way down to the shoulder on your necks with a bushing die. So now I'm going to set both of these dies up to size that brass. I'll show you that you can use either one of these dies and the ammo will probably come out pretty good. So I'll set both of them up. We're running both over a concentricity gauge to see how they come out as far as run out. And then later on down the road, if I have time and have the energy, maybe I'll do a full-on test between the two dies. But for now, I'm going to run everything through the bushing die. Now another subject that comes up is how do I determine what my neck tension is going to be? I've written about it, I've made videos about it, so I'm not going to go all over it again. Go search the website for articles, search the YouTube channel for videos about it, but I'll tell you right now I'm going to put a 292 bushing in this die, and that's what I'm going to run. Okay, the way this works for setting neck tension with the mandrel, these mandrels are set for 2/1000ths under bullet diameter. So if we measure that, you see that's 262. So our 264 bullets, right, that's 2/1000ths under them. So when we run this through this die, which is going to size the brass down further than we need to, that mandrel is going to reset the inside diameter of the neck to 262, which is 2/1000ths smaller than our bullet. So our bullet will have to push through 2/1000ths of neck tension to seat in the neck. Well, when we set this one up without the mandrel, it's going to give us the same thing, because we're going to use the bushing on the outside of it to set the tension on the inside, because we already know what our brass thickness is in the brass we're working with. So all we have to do is run the 292 bushing. Now a lot of guys will say, well, you need to run a mandrel on the inside to push all the imperfections of the brass to the outside of the case. I don't think the bullet really cares where that brass is. The brass is still going to be there. You're still going to have a mass of metal around that neck somewhere, either on the outside or the inside, and by the time you seat the bullet will have pushed the brass to the outside. How does it know where the brass is? So anyway, try that for yourself if you don't believe me. I tried it to see if there was any difference, and I found no difference whatsoever by using a mandrel on the inside after I'd already sized the outside of the neck. It didn't change a thing. So first thing I want to do before I start any sizing session is to start out with clean dies. Even with the brass as clean as it is, it's pretty amazing how much crap can get up in a die. So I clean them out before I start the next big batch. So I just use a gun cleaning patch on a patch holder here and just swab it out. You don't really need any chemicals or anything. Now when the dies are brand new, they come packed in oil and grease. You'll want to clean all that stuff out before you start using them. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is clean out my bushing. And I'll also clean out the neck cavity in the full length sizing die. So I'll do that first. Now clean out my bushing. Clean all the old lube out of it. Looks pretty good. It looks like my mandrels are alright, but I'll go ahead and give them a swipe too. At least in the full length one. Alright. Okay, first thing we want to do is put our shell holder in the ram and then run the ram all the way up so that it's at the top of its travel. Then we're going to screw the die in until it contacts the shell holder. And because I don't know where this brass is going to come out with this die, I'm going to back that off at least half a turn. So I'm off that shell holder completely. That's my starting point. Alright, my case lube of choice is Hornady One Shot, just a spray lube. And what we do is we line them up on a cookie sheet like this that I got at a garage sale for 50 cents or whatever. You can see Jake's lining them up for me right now, and we're going to spray all 100 cases at the same time. Alright, biggest thing is to follow the directions on this one-shot case lube, but you know, it's not rocket science. You're just trying to spray some lube on these cases. So with that lined up like that, I normally just come at it from a few directions. And you want to get it all the way down the case body. And you want to get the outside of the neck. That's it. Okay, and we just want a real quick squirt into our clean die. We'll do both of them. Okay, with my die in the starting position, I'm just going to run this lock nut down until it just contacts the press, but I'm not going to lock anything in place. I just want it to stay there. And I'm going to run a case through it. Now this is the bushing die. So when it went in, it started to size the body, and the neck portion of the case went up into the bushing. So now I'm going to check my bump on this, and remember we want to get to 1.564 with these cases. And I shouldn't be anywhere near that. Well, haven't even started to bump it yet. So I'm just going to start incrementally running this down. Now this will come fast when it does, so make sure you do this slowly. You'll feel it when it gets to the bump. And you don't have to lube the cases again. Okay, we're at 1.564 with that case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to confirm that. I'm going to take another case that I haven't sized yet. And I have another 1.564 with that one. So I know my body, the body portion of this die is set right where I want it now. The shoulder is getting a bump and the neck is going up into the bushing. Okay, it looks good. I took some measurements to make sure I like what I'm looking at. Now I'm going to run a case up into it, size it. And at the top of the stroke, I'm going to hold it there and I'm going to lock my lock nut down. Now the beauty of this is as long as I use that shell holder and this press and that die together, I shouldn't have to adjust that again. That will be my adjustment, that will be my setting for sizing this brass in this chamber. So just keep that in mind. Keep the shell holder, the die, and the press together, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. So we'll take one more measurement. This time we'll make sure we clean all the lube off of it. Put my comparator in. Zero it. Let's take a look. So remember, we're aiming for 1.564 on this. Okay, that one's 1 thou over that, so I'm 1.563. So let's do one more. Make sure I didn't go too far. Now if you go too far, it's not the end of the world. 1,000th here, 1,000th there. Isn't going to kill anything. We just don't want to go too far. .564. That's right where we want to be. So if you have some that are coming out different, so they're coming out too small or they're coming out too long, then what probably happened is that as they came out of the rifle or out of the chamber, they're also too long or too short. So it's not uncommon for the first firing of brass to come out of a chamber and not all be exactly the same. I see it a lot with Lapua brass, and it's no big deal. By the time you get around to the second and third firing, all of this brass is going to be dimensionally identical. So I just don't worry about it. I set it up for an average or the longest case that I get to bump back 1,000th. And one of the things I've noticed is that in a die and on a press, if you have a case, say I ran a case through at 1.566, set for 2,000ths a bump, and I get 1.564, if I run one through at 1.565, it's going to come out at 1.563. So there's spring back in this brass, and dimensionally they're going to vary according to how they came out, how they went into the die, and how they come out of the die. Alright, so let's check our concentricity coming out of the sizing die. And we're going to use this runout gauge here from Sinclair. I'm just going to mount it up in the fixture, and I'm just going to spin it. So it's measuring off the neck. So this press I'm using is the Marksman. And one of the things I wanted to check is to make sure that everything's kind of lined up there. So this is part of the measurement. So I'll measure a few of these. So we're less than 1,000th of an inch. All right, I'm going to let Jake blow through a few rows of that in the full-length bushing die that we have set up. And then I'm going to pull the full-length bushing die out and set up the full-length standard die, and show you some of the dimensional differences between that and the bushing die. When we're done sizing all this brass, we're just going to drop it right back in that case polisher and knock that lube off. It'll come right off after about an hour in the polisher, and then we're going to trim this brass. You like that press, Jake? Pretty nice, huh? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we're going to set up the full length die, just the standard Redding sizing die. So I'm going to run this down. Same idea. I'm going to pull that ram up. I'm going to bottom out on the shell holder. And then I'm going to back it off. I'm going to go a full turn on this one. So I came off a full turn from contact with the shell holder. So I'm just going to finger tighten the lock nut. And we're running one piece of brass up through it. Now I had to go back through and lubricate the insides of these necks as well as the expander mandrel in this die. But other than that, I haven't done anything different at all. So you can see where it came back across the mandrel. Let's check our bump. How lucky is that? 1.564. So let me check one more. .565, 5650. .564. So we got our bump right on the first time just by running down to the shell holder and then backing it off one turn. So that's pretty lucky. But anyway, that's pretty close to what I did with the bushing die. So, you know, the Redding dies themselves are probably pretty consistent in their dimensions. And the only difference between these two dies is how the neck area is bored out. So anyway, I'm going to show you something real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this expander mandrel out and we're going to measure the neck diameter as it comes out of this die. Okay, so now I'm going to remove the mandrel, the whole stem, from the standard sizing die, and we're going to run a piece of brass up through that. So remember, we're 298 on the outside diameter of that neck right now. And we're not using a mandrel coming out, so we aren't setting the final diameter. So let's see what that neck diameter is after it runs up through this die. So it squeezed it down to 286. So now we're going to have to run it back through that mandrel to get it back up to 262. So we've squeezed it down from 298 to 285 and a half, looks like, and now we're going to run it back through a mandrel to get it back up to 292. So what we've done is we've bent that neck twice to get this size. The reason that is because a lot of brass, like Remington I remember, you needed a 288 bushing to get it to the right tension. So, you know, it was quite a bit thinner than Lapua brass. So I'll just put the mandrel back in. We'll run it up. It's going to push over the mandrel, go back into the die, and then it'll set the diameter. So now let's look at the diameter. So our outside diameter now is within 5/10,000ths of the bushing that I used on the other one. So it's just a little bit bigger by 5/10,000ths, and probably not even that. Probably depends on where I have it on the caliper. We're called a 292 neck. So basically it did the same thing for us that the bushing die did, only it had to squeeze that neck down way further than it had to be, and then it had to punch it back out again coming out of it. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to chuck this up in the concentricity gauge and see how it came out. Okay, so now we'll check the concentricity of this piece of brass that came out of the standard sizing die. It still did a good job. We're still maybe right at 1,000th of an inch of runout, which is really good. One of the biggest problems with running a mandrel is that when you pull the brass out of the die, as you start to come down, you're not supporting the case anymore. So, you know, once this goes all the way up into the die, the whole case is supported. But once you come out of the die, just start coming out of the die, then it's not supported anymore, and that mandrel is popping this dimension back out to make it the right diameter. Well, when it's doing that, the case isn't very well supported. So a lot of times it'll bend the neck one way or the other. But it looks like this die and that brass and the way I'm lubing it and everything, that just isn't an issue. Okay, so you can see what the full-length bushing die did with this piece of brass when I ran it through it. Our shoulder length is now 1.564, so it's 2,000ths of shoulder bump from the fired dimension. Our overall length grew a little bit. We're going to trim that off. Our shoulder diameter, the sizing die took it down 3,000ths, but it didn't take it all the way to the 451. So we're still 2,000ths bigger than new brass. Our web diameter didn't change at all between the die and fired in the chamber. And then our neck OD is now 292. That's the neck tension we're going to run in this next cycle of firing. Okay, one more thing to do out in the shop, and that is to trim the brass to length. I trim after every firing, and I've started using this world's finest trimmer from Little Crow Gunworks, and it's pretty slick. What I'm going to do is mount it up in my 3-jaw chuck in the lathe, and let the lathe spin it, and I'll just feed the cases into it. It's designed to be used with a drill, so you can chuck this up in a drill and just spin it on your cases, but the lathe works pretty well, so I'm going to do it that way. The way this trimmer works is it has a cone in here that's specific for the shoulder of the cartridge you're using. So it's supported like that, and the cone is what controls how far the case can go in there. And then back here, there's a milling cutter that's held in by 2 hex screws, and you just push it in and out to adjust the length. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up for a cut. I don't know how short I want it to be yet. Somewhere probably under spec, just to make sure I get them all cut. But wherever I have that set, this will stay there. Alright, I ended up trimming these at 2.020. Nice easy number to remember. And you know, that number isn't critical as long as you're shorter than what it calls for, because you don't want the end of that case jamming up into the end of your chamber. Other than that, I don't really care what the number is. But now the last thing I'm going to do is chamfer and deburr the cases like we did with the new brass. And it's the same deal. I'm just going to use my VLD chamfer tool. And then I'm going to come back over it with this regular old RCBS deburring tool. That's it. Alright, well that's it. That's 100 pieces of sized brass ready to use again in this rifle. Now when I bring this into the reloading room, I'll put a little sticky note in there that tells me what it is and what the dimensions are on it. You know, I've already noted that in my notebook in detail, but I always like to have these notes laying around because I've got a lot of rifles going on sometimes at the same time. Now the one thing that I didn't show in this video that I normally do between the fired brass and the sizing die is anneal the brass. I want to do it all in one big batch, so rather than try to do all 300 pieces on video and all that stuff, I decided to pull 100 pieces out separately just to show you the sizing process. I might go back after I size the rest of the brass and run it through the machine, but I don't think it's necessary on at least the first firing with Lapua brass. So as we get further on down the line and I start running this in big batches and not having to try to video it at all, I will be annealing all these pieces of brass between every firing. I do have a video on this YouTube channel about annealing, so if you want to see how I do it, be sure to check that out. The only other thing I'd mention is before I put primers in this, I'm going to swab out the necks with just an alcohol prep pad, something you can get in a pharmacy like a Walmart, and just run a swab through it real quick to make sure there's absolutely no Hornady one-shot or you know, anything else that might have gotten in there like corncob dust and all that stuff. So I always start with a clean neck, and I use no lubricant in my neck before I seat the bullet. Alright, well it's time to start shooting again. So I've got some sized brass. I'll get the rest of my brass all sized up because I like to have it all in the same batch, all at the same time as much as I can. And then I'm just going to start doing some further load development testing. A lot of it's going to be based on the 140 grain bullets that I did a video about last time. So anyway, these videos are probably going to slow down a little bit as far as the quantity of videos, because I'm going to get into a spot where I have to shoot a lot and stay out in the field. But when the next one comes around, it's going to be all detailed on what my final load was, I hope, and you know, how I got there. So I'll give you the exact recipe as well as all the details surrounding why I picked that load. Until I see you in the next one, Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.